most SharePoint deployments, because of the fact that they're going to be used internally, Windows authentication is absolutely the way to go. However, if I'm going to be creating a SharePoint implementation that's going to be public facing, or maybe because I'm going to have users external to my organization, maybe accessing it as contractors, temp workers, or otherwise, I might not want to set them up with Windows accounts. This is where forms-based authentication comes into play. That forms-based authentication gives us the ability to manage authentication at the ASP.NET level rather than inside of Windows. Now, the big thing that I want to stress right away about forms-based authentication is the fact that this is an ASP.NET technology. And SharePoint, of course, is an ASP.NET application, which is why it can take advantage of forms-based authentication. Let's talk a little bit about the concepts of forms-based authentication and then actually take a look at how to implement it. Forms-based authentication, as I mentioned before, is an ASP.NET technology. It's pretty much been there since ASP.NET 1.0. Now, what's great about forms-based authentication is the fact that it gives us the ability to implement our own custom authentication mechanism. So if I want to be able to store usernames and passwords inside of a custom database, an XML file, simply ask people whether or not they know the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, which of course is 42, then I can do that by utilizing forms-based authentication. The catch, however, with forms-based authentication is the fact that it really doesn't provide anything except for a basic foundation from which I can build my own custom architecture, my own custom solution. This is where membership and roles come into play. That membership and roles, introduced with ASP.NET 2.0, give us a bigger foundation that's built on top of forms-based authentication behind the scenes. Now, why use forms-based authentication? Well, the first big reason is that in certain environments, it can be more secure because you're not going to have a Windows account. You're simply going to have typically a username and a password inside of a database. And while ASP.NET will recognize you, Windows is not going to recognize you. So even if you manage to break out of SharePoint, you're not going to be able to do anything inside of Windows because you haven't yet authenticated against Windows. It also gives us the ability to customize the authentication mechanism. So if I want to, again, store usernames and passwords inside of a SQL, Oracle, MySQL database, Access, an XML file, I have that freedom, I have that capability. Forms-based authentication also doesn't require any form of integration with a third party. So unlike, for example, OAuth, which we're going to talk about in a later lesson, which gives us the ability to store usernames and passwords inside of an external implementation, with forms-based authentication, we don't need any of that. All of that is going to be hosted internally, so it doesn't require any form of integration. Now, the one little catch to forms-based authentication is that there is no front end for managing users. So as far as creating usernames, passwords, roles, managing all of that, that does not exist. Now, we can still go in and set permissions because, after all, these are still going to be normal SharePoint users. So there's not going to be anything special, fancy, or anything like that about these users once they get in SharePoint. So I can still manage my permissions, I can still put them into groups. But the big catch is that as far as creating a brand new user goes, as far as changing somebody's password, there is no UI that's provided out of the box. That being said, though, if you head on over to Codeplex, www.codeplex.com, you're going to find that there's all sorts of different projects there that will give you that type of a front end. In addition, because of the fact that the membership API is honestly quite simple, it wouldn't take very long at all for a .NET developer to create a custom front end for you. Let's turn our attention to the most common implementation for forms-based authentication, which is going to be membership and roles. First up, membership. Membership, as I mentioned before, was introduced with ASP.NET 2.0. Now, one of Microsoft's main goals with ASP.NET 2.0 was to ease developer pain points. In the past, in order to do really anything with forms-based authentication, you had to go in and write all of your own code. You had to create the database, you had to create the code for properly storing usernames and passwords inside that database, you had to create the code for handling the authentication, etc. So to help make life a lot easier, Microsoft implemented this feature called membership. Now, the way that membership is set up is by utilizing providers. Now, the way that a provider works in ASP.NET is it gives you the ability to swap out the backend while the front-end APIs and all the controls stay the same. What's great about this is that it gives us the ability to maybe utilize a different database without having to change anything at all on the front end. So if I need to migrate from, say, Oracle to SQL Server, then I can migrate to that appropriate database, swap out the provider, but everything else on the front end can stay the same. Now, out of the box, we get a couple of different membership providers. We get one for SQL Server, which will give us the ability to store usernames and passwords inside of course, SQL. We also have an Active Directory membership provider. Now, this one's actually pretty cool, because what this will do is it will store your usernames and passwords inside of Active Directory. Now, you might be wondering, well, then if I'm going to store my usernames and passwords inside of Active Directory, why not just simply use Windows-based authentication? Well, the catch with Windows authentication is that you're going to log on to Windows, which means that if you manage to break out of SharePoint, Windows now knows who you are. But if you're using forms-based authentication, regardless of the implementation, and that would include the Active Directory membership provider, you have not authenticated against Windows. ASP.NET knows who you are, but Windows does not. So if you manage to break out of SharePoint, you're not going to be able to do anything inside of Windows. As a result, this can be preferable for an extranet site over using basic authentication. Now, if you decide that those providers aren't going to do it for you, you do have the ability to either create or obtain your own custom provider. Setting up SQL membership basically involves two steps. And these steps are going to be very similar regardless of the type of provider that we're using. Step one is going to be to configure the back end. Now, Microsoft gives us a tool called ASP.NET Red SQL that we can use to configure that back end. Step two is going to be to configure SharePoint to use membership. Now, this needs to be done inside of the web.config file. Now, this needs to be configured for central administration, so that way central administration knows that we're using forms-based authentication. It needs to be configured for each web application that's going to use this provider for forms-based authentication. And it also needs to be configured on the Security Token Service application. The Token Service application is responsible for taking whatever user account credential has been passed into SharePoint and converting that, basically normalizing that into a SharePoint account. And that's going to be a lot of what's going to make the magic happen in tools like the People Picker. So when I go in to find an account, it's basically going to be the exact same process regardless of where the account is actually coming from. Now, IIS can help with that behind-the-scenes configuration. There's going to be a couple little things that IIS isn't going to be able to do for us, but for the most part, IIS will be able to help manage all of that. Now, when we go in to set up our SQL membership provider, you're going to notice that there's a few little options. We have password retrieval, and password reset. Now, password retrieval means that if a user forgets their password, we're actually going to give them their current password. This means that we need to be able to convert that into a password again, which would mean that it's going to need to be stored in reversible encryption or clear text. This is not a best practice. Enable password reset means that if somebody forgets their password, we're going to create for them a brand new password. Now, because of the fact that we'll be creating for them a brand new password, we don't need to know what their existing one was. So we can store our passwords properly secured in a salted and hashed format. That leads us perfectly into the password format. Now, the best practice for storing passwords is to salt and hash them, and if you set the password format to be hashed, that's exactly what the SQL membership provider will do for you. One of the big things that we're going to see inside of IIS is that the default is clear text, so we're going to want to make sure that we change that. We also have the ability to require a unique email address. What's nice about requiring a unique email is that it enables account lookup later on by email address. So if somebody's forgotten both their username and their password, if they give us their email address, we're going to be able to look up their account. And then we also have the ability to set up the minimum required password length and the minimum required number of non-alphanumeric characters. Now, one of the little things that I want to mention about the minimum required non-alphanumeric characters, and this is just from my own real-world experience, you're going to find that for whatever reason, that winds up really confusing people. That the number of times that I will set that up and then I'll get an email back from a user and they'll say, hey, I'm trying to create an account in this and it's giving me, that my password isn't valid. And I'll ask them, okay, well, are you using a non-alphanumeric character? And they'll come back and say, oh yeah, I'm using the number 6. Yeah, that's an alphanumeric character. So I always need to kind of remind them that they need to use something like an exclamation point, a $, or otherwise. So you do have to make sure that your users truly understand what that is. I do find that there's a lot of confusion there. I would also make sure that your users understand that just simply putting an exclamation point at the end of the password doesn't truly help. And that's by far the most common thing that people will do is exclamation point. Now it's secure. Not so much. Okay. Now, I'm going to get in a demo setting up membership and roles here in just a couple of moments. But since it's all going to be done in one fell swoop, I just want to touch on roles here real quickly before we get into our demo. Roles are basically groups, but for forms-based authentication and membership. Now, roles are not enabled by default. I do have to go in and set them up, but they're basically set up in the exact same fashion that membership is set up. That I'm going to need to create the backend database, that I'm going to need to configure SharePoint to use it. Let's take a look at setting up that backend database, setting up everything inside of IIS, setting everything up inside of SharePoint, and then showing how we can allow somebody access into SharePoint by using membership. Let's start off by grabbing a command prompt. So we'll just start CMD, and there's our little command prompt. Now the tool that we want is ASP.NET Reg SQL. And that happens to exist inside of the Microsoft.NET Framework directory in Windows. So we'll just go ahead and say cd /, and we'll say Windows, Microsoft.NET Framework. And you can actually use the framework or framework x64. They both create the exact same database behind the scenes. And then we're going to say /, and then we want version 4. And we'll hit enter. And then it's ASP.NET Reg SQL. And now what you're going to notice is that we get the little wizard here. I'm just simply going to hit next. It's going to ask me to configure my service applications. I'm going to hit next. It's going to ask me for the server. So I'm going to say SQL 2012 primary. geektrainer.com, and I'm going to leave the database as the default name, which will automatically be ASP.NET DB. But if you wanted to change that to be something else, you could. And I'm going to click Next, and then hit Next, and let it create the database for me. Now that we've got the database created, the next thing that we're going to need to do is make sure that our SharePoint service accounts have permissions to that database. That doesn't happen automatically. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kick over to SQL Server, and I've already got the Management Studio up and running. So I'm just going to navigate down into my server, into Security, and into Logins, and then I'm going to go grab my farm account here, and under User Mapping, I'm going to make that a DBO on ASP.NET DB. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with the service account here. Perfect. Okay. So now we've created the backend database, and we have created the permissions necessary. Now let's go ahead and get SharePoint configured. Back to our SharePoint server, and let's bring up IIS. Now, inside of IIS, at the server level, you're going to notice that we can set up connection strings. In order to set up membership, we're going to need to tell the membership provider where our database is. So I'm going to double click on my connection strings here, and I'm going to hit Add, and I'm going to give this a name of ASP.NET DB, my server, which is SQL 2012 primary, geektrainer.com, and then my database, and that's going to be ASP.NET DB. And now I'm going to hit OK. And now we've got our connection string. Now we need to set up our roles and our membership provider. So I'm going to again go back to the server, and then I'm going to click on providers to do this. Now, one of the things that I want to mention before I go anywhere else is that by my doing this, I'm updating the global web.config file, which typically speaking is exactly the way that I want to configure this. Now, if I want to get a little bit more lower level here, a little bit more of a finite level of control, you'll notice that if I go under Sites and I choose, for example, SharePoint Intranet, that I could also set up my providers there as well. But in my case, again, I want to do this globally because it's going to help make my life a little bit easier. So I'm going to go to SharePoint 2013, and then I'm going to double click on Providers. Now, you're going to notice inside of here I can set up my providers, and right now I've got my roles selected. So I'm going to hit Add, and under Type, I'm going to choose SQL Role Provider, and I'm going to give this a name of SharePoint Roles. Now it's going to ask me for that connection string name. Fortunately, it gives me a little drop down for that, so I can just choose ASP.NET DB. And then it's going to ask me for the name of the application. The application name is what's going to actually give me the ability to have multiple front ends use the exact same back-end database. Typically, that's not the way that I want to set things up. That usually I kind of want one per application when I'm doing like ASP.NET. But with SharePoint, quite frequently I'm going to want everything inside of that one centralized database. So normally what you're going to do is just set the application name to be a /, basically just kind of indicating that, hey, this is going to be the root, and then go from there. So that's exactly what I've got done right there. So I'm going to hit OK, and now we've got our SharePoint roles. Let's do the exact same thing with our users. We'll hit Add, and on our drop-down, we'll go ahead and say SQL Membership. On our name, we'll say SharePoint Membership. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll up to the very top here, and you'll notice my password reset. I want to enable that, so we'll set that to true. We've got our unique email, and I want that, so I'm going to set that to true. And then finally, last but not least, is that store password in secure format. And again, I want to make sure that that is set to true. That is what's going to automatically set my password format for me to be hashed. Make sure that you set that to be true. It's going to ask me for my connection string name. I'm going to use the exact same connection string, and it's going to ask me for my application name, and again, I want that to be a /. Okay. Now, the one last little spot that I need to go in and set this up is inside of my security token service application. Unfortunately, inside of here, inheritance is disabled. So what I need to do is I need to reset up my providers inside of here. So I'm just going to walk through the same steps here. We'll just double click on our providers. We're going to say add, and we'll go ahead and choose roles, SharePoint roles, our connection string, and our application name. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with our users here. Add. There we go. SharePoint membership. And again, I'm going to say true. I'm going to say on the unique email, true. And our store in secure format, we'll say true. Our connection string will be ASP.NET-DB. And our application name is going to be a /. Okay. Now, normally, if you're going to be setting up membership for ASP.NET, that would actually be all that you would have to do. But unfortunately, there are a couple of little things that need to be done specific to SharePoint. Because SharePoint needs to know that we're using forms-based authentication, needs to know how to search inside of that database. And the way that that's going to be done is by setting up the wildcard for the people picker. That people picker is where we're going to go to actually go find our users. That needs to be configured. And it's going to need to be configured for central administration and for every single web application that's going to be using forms-based authentication. Now, unfortunately, IIS doesn't give us the ability to set this, so we are going to have to go into our web application web.config file and set it inside of there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to SharePoint Intranet, and I'm going to click Explore, because what that will do is it will automatically open up the virtual directory for me, and then you'll notice that there's my web.config. So let me just double click on that. And then if I just simply do a search for my people picker, I'm going to find that just down below. And what I can do is I can actually just get rid of that ASP.NET SQL membership provider. We're not using it, and just replace that with my SharePoint membership, just like that. And so now I'm going to hit save. I'm going to close that out, and I'm going to do the exact same thing to central administration. So we'll go to central administration, we'll go to explore, web.config, do a search for people picker, and again, SharePoint membership. Okay. And now we've got all of that configured. So all of that is the behind the scenes stuff. Now let's take a look at the front end. I'm going to bring up central administration. And this is going to take a second because it just needs to compile. Now to configure our membership provider in SharePoint, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Manage Web Applications. I'm going to choose Intranet. And then under my authentication providers, I'm going to click the zone. I'm going to scroll on down. I'm going to put a little check next to enable forms-based authentication. For membership, this is going to be SharePoint membership. For my roles, this is going to be SharePoint roles. And I'm going to scroll down and hit save. And so now we've got our cool new provider created. So in our little mental checklist here, what we've now done is we've created the back end. We set up everything that needs to be set up inside of IIS, and we told SharePoint about it. So we're all set and ready to go, except for the fact that we don't have any users yet. Now remember again that we're not going to get a UI for setting up users. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a couple of users here. Now, fortunately, IIS gives us some basic capabilities for going in and setting up user accounts. It's not a tool that's necessarily going to be designed for production, but if I just need a couple of accounts so I can get things up and running, this is a perfect tool for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to IIS, and I'm going to go to my intranet site. Now, right over here, I've got my .NET roles and my .NET users, which will give me those basic management capabilities. Now, what I'm going to need is some default providers for each. So I'm going to go to my roles, and when I double click on it, you'll notice I'm going to get a little error message telling me, hey, I don't have a default provider. That's okay. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to click Set Default Provider, hit my drop down, choose my SharePoint roles, hit OK. And now I'm just going to double back, go back to my intranet, go to my users, get basically the same error message, and then I'm going to go in, set my default provider, hit the drop down, SharePoint membership, and hit OK. Now, that's just one of those things that just needs to be done to enable this tool inside of IIS. And now I'm ready to create a user. So let's go ahead and say add. And let's make this our public user here. So I'm just going to say public user, and we'll say public user at trainsignal.com, and we'll give them a password. Now, like I've mentioned before, the whole reason to be creating this is typically for something that's going to be public facing, or maybe for an extranet user where I don't want to give somebody access. So let's kind of imagine, if you will, that I'm setting this up for the outside world. We've got a brand new user that needs to be able to connect, and this is the way that I can now support them. So we'll create the account inside of the database. We're going to hit next, and we're going to hit finish. Cool. But just because you have an account doesn't mean that you have permissions to SharePoint. There are no default permissions in SharePoint. So I'm going to need to grant that public user permissions inside of SharePoint. So I'm going to fire back up my browser here. I'm going to go back to my little intranet site here. Now what you're going to notice is SharePoint's now going to prompt me for a mode of authentication. The reason for that is because we could log on in one of a couple of different ways. That we could be logging on by utilizing Windows authentication or forms-based authentication. You'll notice on the little drop-down that it's going to ask me exactly that. Do I want to use Windows, or do I want to use forms-based authentication? Now, one of the little things to keep in mind is that if you are going to be providing multiple forms of authentication for your users, then a lot of times your users aren't going to have the tech savvy to know what the difference is between Windows and forms-based authentication. So I'll want to potentially customize this page. That is going to require a developer, but in the long run, it is going to make your users' lives easier and help them better understand exactly which one it is that they should be choosing. Now, there are no default permissions in SharePoint, so that public user that we created, we're going to need to give that public user some permissions here. So I'm going to log in as myself first. So I'm going to go to Windows Authentication, and I'm going to click on the little gear, and I'm going to go to Site Settings. And so now inside of my people and groups, I'm going to click on New, and I'm going to type in public user. And sure enough, it'll display down at the bottom there my little public user. So I'm going to click that, and I'm going to hit share. Cool. So our public user is now a member of this site, meaning that they'll be able to do things like create lists, delete items, etc. We'll talk more about security a little bit later. But for right now, let's prove that our public user can now access this site. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log off. And after I log off, I'll be prompted with the little sign-in page. So I'm going to hit my little drop-down. I'm going to choose Forms Authentication. We'll type in our public user. We'll type in our password. And I'm going to click Sign In. And now what you're going to notice is that I have permissions to the site. And if you take a look in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to notice that I am, in fact, logged in as the public user. Now again, forms-based authentication is great for environments where maybe we're not using Windows, or great for environments where we're going to be creating something that is public-facing. There's how we can set up FPA. I'm going to see you in the next lesson.